Welcome back to another episode of the Sky Society podcast. Today, I am super excited to be chatting with Valentina Bojanini. She is the Senior Marketing Manager at TED Conferences. Welcome, Valentina.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. I'm very excited to jump into your career journey and your advice for women in marketing. But before we do all of that, can you tell me a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I am a marketing slash audience slash like content human. Really think of myself as like a media strategist. And I've, had like a long journey in media spaces, but outside of work, I'm also an artist. I love to, listen to podcasts. I love to go on walks. I love to travel. So I'm kind of like a, a complicated, person outside of just work.
I love that. What
Yeah.
type of art do you do?
I mostly paint, but I also do ceramics, which is really fun.
Oh,
And yeah, it's fun to have like a little bit of a creative outlet outside of work and have like a little separate thing. But I live in Oakland, California. I used to live in New York for a long time and moved out here just before the pandemic. And then like going way back, I'm originally from Colombia in South America. I was born in Medellin, and then I grew up like on a little island, like 20 minutes from Seattle, called Vashon.
wow.
So yeah, it's kind
What
of
age
fun.
did you
I have a
move to
very
the
like
US?
I moved when I was like 5.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, and then I'd spend all my summers in Colombia. So I have like that like dual culture thing kind of going on. Like I would sort of hop
Yeah.
from being in the States and then hop into being Colombia and just kind of switch back and forth all year round.
Oh my gosh. So every year you would like go back to Colombia every single year? That
Yeah,
is
yeah, for the
wild.
summer.
Do you still go back a lot?
Yeah, I try to. Since the pandemic, it's been so much harder. Like it was
Yeah.
such a such an easier trek when, I was in school and there were just like defined breaks, but now it's a little bit harder to fit it in, but I try to go back as often as I can.
I've heard Colombia is absolutely beautiful. Like I have just heard the
It
best
is.
things. Uh,
Yeah, it's beautiful.
and then your family is here in the US now. You live or they're
Yeah, a
close
lot of
by?
them are, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's awesome. Okay, so family's from Colombia and you had to start your career here in the US. Did that present any challenges for you when you were getting started of just like not having, did you have connections when you just started, or kind of how did that impact you going into your career?
I think in general, I come from like a family of overachievers. So if anything, it was sort of like I had a very clear sense of, like my cousins had found like amazing, interesting jobs. My family in general is just like really they are an overachieving family. So I just kind of knew that I was going to end up doing something interesting. I just didn't know what that looked like for me. So I had examples of like, I have an aunt who's an artist, and I also have an aunt who like runs a company. So there's like a lot of different paths. But I always imagined that I was going to kind of follow in a similar kind of trajectory, like something that mixed creativity with something that actually made me money.
Yeah.
I think it was important for me to feel like whatever job I went into was like secure and stable. And I could also just like be myself in my job. Like I didn't want to have to show up to a workspace and then have to like pretend to be somebody else to be able to be successful there. I wanted to be able to
Yes.
be all the different versions of me that exist in a work context.
That is really hard to do. And I think even just like you
Yeah.
said, I wanted to be creative and make money. I feel like we almost think that's a lot of us feel like that's a pipe dream of just like, can you really do both? Like if you're going to be creative, you have to be a starving artist. And, can
Oh
you
my
really
God, yeah.
have can you really have both things? Can you be creative in your work and also, earn the amount of money that you're looking to earn in your life and not feel like you have to sacrifice one or the other? I'm curious when you were kind of going through your career and you were experiencing or kind of figuring out where you were belonging, what did you notice about your relationship with work and kind of what type of relationship with work do you have now?
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's a journey, right? I think like a lot of us, when we start work and start kind of thinking about what that's going to look like for us, like I remember in college, I had a really, like strong sense that I wanted to have work that I felt like incredibly passionate about. And I was like, it was aligned with some sort of higher purpose. And in some ways, that is what my career looks like. And in other ways, it's totally different. Like I think my relationship to my job has really evolved over time, where it has become a smaller and smaller piece of my personality and of the things that I kind of think of myself as on a daily basis. It's really important for me to have kind of like the part of my life that is work. Like I do spend a lot of time doing my job. So I want to feel connected to it and I want to care, but I also need that space so that I can be a human outside of it. And I think that was a journey for me to figure out which parts of myself like I need to have fed by work and which parts actually can be fed by other things outside of work. I think like going back to our conversation around creativity, like that was a really big struggle for me. Like from like after graduating to where I am now, I've definitely had moments in my work where I felt so kind of removed from the creative production of something. And I wanted, to have more access to like making things. And then I've sort of thought about, okay, is it that I want to have a job that's more creative, or is it actually that I need to be pursuing more creative things outside of work? And then use this other part of my brain at work. And for me, it ended up being that like I needed to have more space for myself to like do creative things outside of the office. Like I take a ceramics class every Tuesday. It's like really important to me. It's part of my like meditation routine essentially. And then I come to work and there are moments where I get to be involved in a creative process, but I'm not, like making something every day. And I'm good with that. Like that actually
Yeah.
is interesting and fun for me, but that dynamic has not always been easy and I think was definitely something that I just needed like time and perspective to figure out what that meant for me. But I think it's hard
Yeah.
for a lot of people.
So if it's like a Tuesday and you're at work and it is just a crazy day and there's so much to be done, there's like a deadline at the end of the week and you were feeling so stressed, I feel like a lot of us would want to cancel our Tuesday ceramic class because we would feel overwhelmed. Like I know
Yeah,
for me, the first thing is like, oh, I love working out. I'm really stressful. Gonna cancel my whatever, my evening Pilates class.
totally. Like my yoga class is canceled now because I
Yes.
worked like 2 minutes too long and now I don't want to do it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So how do you kind of set that boundary of like, I'm gonna leave the office, I'm gonna go do the thing that I know gives me like so much happiness and so much life. Like, how do you find that balance? Because I think especially when you're young, you know you can always do more at work, right? You can technically always
Yeah.
do more. So you have to like make the decision to say my work day is done and I'm going to go do something for me. So how have you kind of navigated that?
It's so there's like two answers to this. One, it's like you're only paid to work for a certain amount of time. And so for me, I like use that as a boundary for myself where I say like I'm paid to work, I guess because I work West Coast hours for an East Coast company. Like I work 7:30 to 3:30. That's like my schedule. And there are days, yes, where I will work later than that, but I know in my mind, like that's a time period that I am being paid to work. And so if I'm working beyond that, like I'm doing free labor and that work's going to be there the next day. Right. So I have over time really had to like hone the part of me that's able to say, this is actually a priority. Like this needs to get done today. And this isn't a priority. Like this is a nice to have. And so I try to keep the boundary that way. And then the other thing is like, yeah, it is hard sometimes to say, oh my God, I'm so tired. Like, I had so many meetings today. I, worked on so many weird little projects and I just want to veg out. But I also know that doing something like a ceramics class, like a workout class, like seeing your friends, any of those things are ultimately going to fill up your cup more than working longer. Like
Yeah.
I just know that I can't, it's not, I'm not going to feel great at the end of the day if I was like, wow, what a Tuesday I had. I worked until 8 p.m. and I didn't have any fun outside of it. Like it's just not going to sit right with me. And I really like try to be real with myself about that and just say, all right, I'm closing my laptop. Goodbye. Like
Yeah.
the workday's over.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think that helps you also show up better the next day is when you do get that recharge, you
Totally.
can be better at work the next day.
Yeah.
So you've been at TED for almost 6 years now, which is
Yeah.
crazy. Um, Can you tell me? So I feel like now, especially when I see someone with like a tenure at a company that long, I'm always a little bit
Yeah.
in shock because I think it's really common for people to
Yeah.
like leave jobs every couple of years. So can you tell me a little bit about your experience here at TED, why you've chosen to stay for so long?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about
Totally. Yeah. I think I always say that I wouldn't have stayed at TED for so long if my job wasn't drastically different like every few years. And so in some ways, I think I've had the benefit of being at a company for this amount of time, so I really know it deeply, and that actually makes my work easier because I kind of know like how to get things done. But I've also built a lot of trust and a lot of relationships with people across a bunch of different areas of my company, which has made it so that my job can like evolve a lot from one year to the next. So I started at TED as like a social media assistant, which I think is like a very kind of common intro into the world of marketing. I came from a journalism background, and so social media was like one of those things where you just kind of knew like if you can write, like you can probably end up in like a social media job. And so I did, and I was lucky that kind of like less than a year into me working at that job, our team became an audience development team. And at the time, I didn't even really know what audience development was, but you know, Carla Zanoni, who's the director who came in to build that team, she was very much like, this spans everything. Like audience development is everything from like marketing, social, like content creation, data, and really like expanded what my world looked like and what my day-to-day work looked like. And so that kept me hooked. And then I, you know, kind of shifted my work more into this like marketing side of things. And um you know, I was working on our podcast, I was working on our membership program, I was working on all of these different things that TED wanted to market. And I got offered another job at another company, and I had this moment of like, okay, what do I want out of my career right now? Like, do I want to kind of evolve my job at TED and make it look more like something that I want to do long term, like take this as an opportunity to shift what I'm doing, or do I want to just go to another company and see what that's like? And I actually decided that I valued the relationships at TED and what my day-to-day like work life looked like, the people that I spent time with, the people that I had to be in meetings with all day, like I really liked them. And so I just said, like, that's half of work is who you work with. So I stayed, and I I got to kind of shift my job a little bit more. So I like went a bit deeper into the marketing world, and that was really exciting. And then kind of out of nowhere, I guess a year ago now, a person who I worked really, really closely with on the podcast side of Ted's work. She was like our podcast marketing human. She left, and I'd already been working on podcasts. I have a background in podcasts. So it was this very like natural transition where I got to like drastically shift my job again to really just thinking about like our audio offering. And now my job is like, I guess, marketing, but also I think about content strategy, and I get to think about audience growth, and I get to think about how we monetize our podcasts, and it feels really expansive. So I think because it's shifted so much every few years, it's kept me interested and hooked. And it's the people also that are the reason
yeah.
that I'm still at TED. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a good point. You make that half of your job as the people that you work with and really liking who you work with. I feel like that's such an undervalued
Yeah,
characteristic of a role that makes you happy. We don't always think about that, but I think, like you said, it's so important. And also interesting to hear just like how much your role has shifted. And I can imagine that also
yeah,
keeps like staying at the same role very exciting because you're not doing the same thing, but you are keeping around the people
totally.
that you like, but your day-to-day looks is a little bit different. I'm super interested in your role now. So you mentioned you're with doing audience
Yeah,
development specifically for podcast marketing. And podcasting has changed so much over the past couple of years.
yeah,
It what didn't exist. It grew massive. Now we're in like TikTok era where everybody's attention spans are shortening. So I'm curious
totally.
on kind of your insights into podcast marketing and kind of where you think it's going now with just how the era or how content is evolving.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. Like podcasts are in some way this medium that has been around for a long time and it has its roots in like radio. And I think it's sort of interesting because TikTok has made it seem like podcasts are kind of new. I think just because we're actually seeing people record them. Um, but the industry, I think, has shifted so much in the last few years. And the biggest shift is that I think while podcasting itself is not new, like the way that we monetize podcasts is really new. And so people are kind of trying to figure out like how do you have like a sustainable podcast business? Like are you selling ads? Like are you just like the person saying like, "Oh my god, I cooked HelloFresh today?" Or are you like doing branded content? Are you, getting like a sponsor for your whole season? Like are you even monetizing your podcast? Do you have a Patreon? Like there's all these interesting ways that people are developing like businesses around podcasting and like monetizing audience loyalty, which I think is really interesting and is like a thing that's going to keep evolving. So, what's really exciting about the podcast space generally is that even though it's been around for like definitely over a decade, it's it's just like in this kind of evolution constantly. And I think the content is going through an evolution. I think for a long time you heard a lot of podcasts that sounded like some of the OGs like Radiolab, where they're like really produced and really sound designed. And now they're sort of evolving to being like chat casts, where it's just two people talking to each other and they have a relationship with the host and they feel really connected to them. And I think in terms of actually marketing a show, like that's the piece that's really exciting is that now, like, you really get to think about marketing the host and how do you like build that relationship between the audience and the person that they're spending time with. Like people think of their podcast host, humans as their friends. Like you spend time with them on a regular basis and there's not a lot of mediums that have that like intimacy and that ability to build a relationship. I think like you can have a relationship with like a content creator on TikTok, but it's really different when you're like spending like a good hour with them, like hearing them talk to someone or like sharing their ideas. And I think that's what makes it really unique and also what makes podcasting like such an opportunity for like monetization too, because if you have a relationship with someone, you're going to like trust their recommendations around things. So I think we're in a really interesting part where we're now having these like more host led pods. And yeah, I'm excited to see how that kind of keeps evolving.
Yeah, it is interesting. Do you think people are listening to podcasts? So now with TikTok, I know even I consume lots of clips. Like I love watching little clips from
Yeah,
podcasts.
totally.
I think it's fun to get like a little like bite size, you know, piece of a piece of content. But
Yeah.
I know some friends that I talk to say that they don't listen to podcasts or they're just not as there's like ranges of like my podcast girlies that
Yeah,
like love
totally.
them. They have their lists of all their
Yeah.
favorites, and I have others that don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you feel like with shortened because like TikTok has kind of like gotten us accustomed to shortened clips that people are listening to podcasts less now, or do you think that's not really the case?
I actually think it's not the case. Like I mean, obviously TikTok has like shifted so much of our attention span, like all of social media has. Um, but I think that the podcast space is like growing. Like there are new podcast fans every day. I think what is definitely an interesting kind of dynamic is figuring out like where does this like honestly like pretty long form content like fit into people's days when they're so used to getting stuff in bite-sized pieces. And I think it's like you got to meet your audience where they are. Like some people are not going to listen to your whole podcast, but they might be a person who watches like every clip of your podcast on social, and that's you're spreading your idea. Like you're building your
Mhm.
podcast that way, and I think that's a win. I feel like you know, the podcast space and a lot of other media spaces have this sort of like fondness for a different era where people would spend time like reading really long articles or spend time like kind of watching like a really long video. And we're not really in that space anymore. So we
Yeah.
have to take the wins where they are. Like our audience might just want the 30-second version of the podcast. And then someone else is going to be like, no, I will listen to it from beginning to end. And I think that segment is actually growing. And I think we've seen like there is kind of this reaction within Gen Z, like away from the like fast pacedness of social and like a growing interest in like magazines and in like kind of
Mhm.
slowing down and like reading. That's also a trend. And so I think podcasts are really like well positioned to fit into people's days while still being like a lean back thing that you can consume. Like you can do a lot of stuff while listening to a podcast. So I
Yeah.
think it's like an interesting middle ground between like a TikTok and like reading a book. You know,
Yeah.
it can fit into your life more easily.
I know, like for me, I like to listen to them. Let's say I'm like cleaning my apartment, and I just like put a
Totally.
podcast on, so I'm not like in silence. But I can't like commit to like sitting and scrolling on my phone, or even sometimes I know people sometimes hear this and they I don't know. Sometimes people do this and they don't. But I listen to podcasts when I work out, and I know it's not like the hype music,
Yeah.
but like sometimes it's
I know
nice.
it's so wild.
It's like a
Yeah.
distraction from like the whatever I'm
Yeah.
doing, like, and so. But one thing I have kind of asked myself, especially with Sky Society and like doing this podcast, and it's been really fun to grow it. But I'm also curious, or just kind of interested in like I wonder how the future of that will change. But it is interesting to see like Gen Z come up because they're coming up more with TikTok, but we're also seeing like they drink alcohol less, or they're looking for more
Yeah.
authenticity, or kind of how the
Yeah.
generations change as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So going into like podcast marketing, what are your like if you're going to market a podcast, what are some either mistakes that you see other podcasts making that you think are gaps to fill, or what are some things that you find are really successful when it comes to podcast marketing?
Podcast marketing is like it's such an interesting part of marketing because a lot of the same things apply, but they sort of apply in a different way. So like an example of something that works really well to market a podcast is cross promotions. And what those are is just basically like ads that you hear on other podcasts for other shows. So for example, like you'll be listening to Hidden Brain and you'll hear like a 30-second ad for one of Ted's podcasts. And
Mhm.
what's interesting about that is that I think in traditional marketing, like that's a spot you would have to pay for. But the
Yeah.
podcast industry is really relationship based. And all of those cross promos are usually barters. Like it's the people from, Hidden Brain coming to us and saying, like, hey, we want to promote our podcast. And like, do you have space on this show? We'll promote yours on our show. And that's a really unique way of like growing an audience. And it's also really effective. You can have hosts read ads for a podcast and really kind of drive home for the listener, like, hey, this is a show I really like listening to. If you like this show, you're going to love this other podcast. And that kind of endorsement from a host, I think, goes a really long way. Um, and you can get really specific about the audiences that you're reaching that way. Like you can really think about, okay, like this is a business podcast, for example, like who is in a similar space, like who is reaching like young career professionals, like how do I tap into that audience? And you have something to offer the podcast that you're tapping into as well. So I think that part of it is really interesting and fun. And I think just like at a minimum, podcasts everywhere should be trying cross promos if they're not already. But the other thing is like doing guest swaps. Like I think it's really cool to hear a podcast host on a different podcast that's like reaching an aligned audience. And, people are listening to podcasts for the host. So what a better ad for your show than having, the host of a podcast as a guest on another show.
Yeah.
I think in terms of mistakes, it's like not thinking about what your audience wants out of the listening experience. Like if you don't think about, you know, who am I talking to? What are they looking for? Like with any marketing, if you're forgetting your audience, then it's probably not going to land. But yeah, I think the industry is really fun. There's a lot of different ways that you can market a show that kind of fall outside of the normal, like, oh, like we're going to promote it on social. Like, yeah, that's part of it. But actually, like the world of promoting with an audio is like so much more interesting and is going to be really effective at converting people.
Valentina, it's super interesting hearing that this is a big part of your role because I feel like it ties so closely to who you are because you mentioned just like how much you love
Yeah.
relationship building. And now, obviously, with
Yeah.
podcast marketing, what's super unique with it is that it is seemingly like very much relationship building. Like, oh, we're not just going to pay for an ad
Yeah.
spot. I'm going to have a relationship with this podcast and we're going to do a swap
Yeah.
or we're going to do a guest swap or an ad swap. And so I can see how that kind of plays into your strengths as well and getting to use that in your current role, which also is super, super exciting to hear.
Yeah, definitely. There's a really nice overlap there. Like it feels
Yeah.
very authentic and sort of sweet that that's the way that podcasts grow. Like how crazy. Like half of marketing in other places is like, ooh, okay, like we're gonna do this ad buy, we're gonna do whatever. And this is very much like, all right, like what podcast do we have connections to? Where can we deepen a relationship? How can we like do content swaps with them? How can we like really build on that relationship? And I think that's really fun and kind of freeing when you think about what marketing can look like.
Yeah. Super interesting. Okay. Also, since you work at TED, I feel like I have to also ask you, what is your favorite TED Talk?
Oh my gosh. I have a few. Um, I think most recently, and this is kind of like a deep cut, there's this woman named Alua Arthur who's a death doula, and she gave like an incredible talk last year at the TED conference about like dying, which is really it was like, oh God, is what's this talk gonna be like? But it was so beautiful and so moving because she talked about kind of what makes life so beautiful is that it's finite, and she just had such an interesting perspective on life and on what end of life can look like. And I'd never really heard someone talk about, like the whole concept of like dying well. And so
Yeah.
she also did it with just like so much joy and so much spark, and everybody was like laughing and crying and just having such like emotional highs and lows listening to that talk, which I don't know, it was really moving and I loved it. So that's
What's that?
definitely one
Sorry,
of my
what's a death
favorites.
doula?
A death doula is like someone who comes in when someone is close to dying and like helps them process what's happening and helps them kind of like reflect on their life and figure out kind of how to
Oh,
let go. And
okay.
it's so like magical to hear someone talk about that because it's a part of life that people don't love to think about death,
Yeah.
but I'm not a person who's like, wow, this is really weighing heavy on my mind. Like I'm 28. It feels a little distant. And so it was fascinating hearing her kind of talk through that part of her life and how she helps people in these moments and the families too, like how she helps people process grief. It was moving. So Alua Arthur, she's great.
Mhm.
Love it.
Okay. I'll have to add that one to my list. I'm also curious because I mean, TED is a very unique company to be able to work for, and you're being surrounded by all of this inspiration all of the time. Does that play like a big part into your enjoyment of the work, or how does that kind of influence your experience working there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think TED is a really interesting and like special place to work. And I think what has helped me stay at that job for so long is that, you know, it like fundamentally wants to do something good in the world. And so I think because of that, it is much easier to go to work every day and be like, you know what? Every company has flaws. Like there's always something that you're not going to agree with in your workplace or that you're going to have a hard time processing, but if at its core, it's a place that is trying to do like a net good for the world, then I think it makes it a
Mhm.
lot easier to navigate. And so that has been part of what's kept me around for so long, is just that like I trust the intentions of the company to like actually want to create like a positive impact in people's lives. Like, a lot of the conversations we have are even around like, how do you measure impact? How do you measure like the way that watching like Brene Brown's TED Talk on vulnerability can like change someone's life, because it does change people's lives. And so I think that is really special, and being able to have conversations like that on a regular basis in my workplace, like I I love that that's something that comes up. I think a lot of other companies aren't necessarily like mission driven in the same way. They may have like a specific, like a smaller vision, but it's kind of part of like a larger thing. For TED, like the mission is the company.
Yeah.
And so I think, yeah, that has been really special and kind of exciting for me to be a part of on a daily basis.
Yeah, I one of the things that I teach is career contentment in our accelerator. And one of there's like different pieces that go into that. But one of the
Yeah.
things is that you feel like you're helping other people. And obviously you, I feel like, are in an extreme working for TED where it's like that, like you said, it's a huge part of their mission. However, I
Yeah.
think a lot of other companies in different ways, when you feel like, even if your company, isn't having a like an overall like impact like TED, even if
Yeah.
it's something small, it makes I think a really big difference in you like wanting to come to work, you feeling motivated for the work that you do because you're feeling like you're having a greater impact that's bigger than yourself. And we touched on
Yeah.
like having good relationships at work, but I think that's also one of those pieces that I think is so important.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't agree more.
All right, Valentina. Okay, we kind of focused a lot on TED, which I love. I wanna go and hear a little bit about your experience prior to TED because you got your bachelor's in journalism and social and cultural analysis, and then you went on to do some interesting things after
Yeah.
that. So, can you talk to me about what your career was like before kind of finding your foothold in TED?
Totally. So I was editor in chief of NYU's newspaper, which was like a really formative part of my time at NYU. And when I graduated, I honestly had like burnt myself out. Like being editor in chief, like you're not sleeping a ton, you're working so much. And I had just kind of this moment of like, okay, actually, I don't want to be a journalist, but what do I want to be? I want to be kind of like in a media company in some way. And so I applied to an internship at Radio Lab, and I got to be like a little tiny Radio Lab intern. I worked there for like 6 months, and that was really exciting. I got to try so much out. Like I was doing research, I was doing audio editing. It was really like very formative. But I'm gonna be honest, like that time after graduating college is like super destabilizing in terms of trying to figure out like what do I want to do with my life. There's so many options. And I think, you know, I had that job at Radiolab, but that was like only a few hours a week. So I had a lot of free time that I was trying to figure out how to fill. And part of the way that I was doing it was, I had reached out to kind of my professors at NYU and was doing like kind of different random tasks for them. I was helping one of my journalism professors with, transcribing interviews that she was doing. I was, you know, doing all kinds of kind of like odd jobs, but it was all in service of this idea of like relationship building. And while I was at Radiolab, I was trying to think about like what's my next move. And one of the professors that I had kind of been freelancing for reached out to me and was like, randomly, I have this, you know, friend who is starting a late night show that he's piloting. And like, would you want to be a researcher on that show? So after Radiolab, I went and I was like a researcher on a pilot for a late night TV show. Um, and the show ended up doing two pilots. It like never got picked up, but it was such a an interesting experience being like in a writer's room, working with like the host of the show, working with all the other people who are making it happen. And I really loved it, and I was trying to figure out, okay, like what does this mean for my career? Like, do I want to go into TV? I don't really think so, but I liked having kind of the types of conversations I was having on a regular basis about like how do we make the show interesting for an audience. And then like randomly I went to a friend's wedding who I like truly barely knew. I was like a friend of a friend at this wedding, and they were just like, "Hey, you hung out with the bride and groom once, like come to the reception." And at that reception I met someone whose wife worked at TED, and he was like, "Hey, my wife's not here right now, but you guys would really be friends. I'm putting you two on an email together, and like you should get coffee." And like in front of me,
Oh
this man like
my
put me on an email with this woman who was like, "Oh yeah, like I know a person at TED who's hiring, like you should meet her." And that was how I got my foot in the door, which is all to say like relationships are everything. Like not to be a meme
gosh.
of myself, but like truly every job that I've gotten is because I was able to connect with someone and really like, organically and authentically like build a friendship with them and build a connection. Um, and so, yeah, it's really special. I like ended up at TED by chance. And I think that you never know like who you meet like can really alter like the span of your career and like what you go into. I think I just as easily could have gone into a million other fields and like had a completely different career, but it's like one moment that just kind of like shifts where you're going. So you have to
Yeah.
kind of be open to writing that and seeing like what's being presented to you.
That is wild. What a crazy little
I
journey
know.
you had. When you said you were editorial or director at NYU, it reminds me of, did you ever watch Gilmore Girls and how Rory
Oh my
was
God, yes.
the
Yes,
director of
literally.
whatever, in charge of her
Yeah,
newspaper?
editor
And
in chief. Yeah.
yes, yes, I'm thinking like you're Rory and yeah, and how stressful it
I
was.
was worried, and I was that uptight too. Like we love to learn and grow. I think that was also like why I now have actual boundaries with my work because you know, you have loose boundaries in college anyway. Like you're just figuring out who you
Yeah.
are as a person. But I think I learned very quickly after that, like, nope, work cannot be your whole life.
Yeah.
You need to have distance. And yeah, so it was formative in a lot of ways. But yeah, everybody like work for their, school newspaper. It will change your life probably.
Yeah, that is a crazy journey. So I have to know because you keep coming back to this theme of excuse me, excuse me, relationship building, and
Yeah.
you seems like that is just a huge skill that you have. So what advice would you give to someone to help them improve their relationship building skills so they can form better connections with the people that they meet in their lives?
Yeah. Yeah, I think people get really like grossed out by the idea of networking and like myself included. And I think it's because we kind of need to reframe what that is. Like, you're just making a friend.
Yeah.
Like, I really believe that you can have like an interesting conversation with anyone. You just have to be open and like talk to them like people. I think work is usually like the least interesting thing about someone. And most people, they'll talk to you about their jobs, but they don't really want to. They want to talk about like what they do for fun. They want to talk about their interests and their hobbies and like whatever they saw online recently. So I when I have the opportunity to meet new people, I want to get to know them for them. So like we can small talk, we can talk about, anything that's going on in life and culture and just like have a moment to like have a real connection with someone. I think if you go into a conversation, like a networking conversation, quote unquote, with this idea of like, oh, I'm gonna get something from this. Like I'm gonna get my next job out of this. You're gonna have a much less authentic conversation than if you're just like, hey, I'm meeting someone who's gonna be a connection for me. And I think that can really unlock a lot. It takes a lot of the pressure out of it. You don't feel like you're in a job interview every time you're talking with someone. And instead, you can just like genuinely make a friend. And you have no idea when that friend could be, a big part of your career in the future. Like you're going to be in that person's mind. And I think it's good also to like call on your network of people when you need help. Like if you are looking for a job, you can ask like someone that you have, you know, a friendship with and be like, hey, do you know anyone that works in this industry? I'm just trying to meet people. Like I'm not trying, I don't need to call your friend and ask them for a job. I just want to talk to them. And I think that takes pressure off and it also opens doors. So that's like my biggest advice is just talk like you're a human to human. No one wants to feel like they're in a job interview 24/7. So don't put that pressure on yourself.
I think that's such a beautiful way to look at it. And also that working doesn't have to take place in networking settings, kind of like how, you were at this
Yeah.
wedding and you went to a reception and you're just being open to opportunity and just being really genuine from the start, right? You're not looking to get something out of the people that you're meeting. You're just trying to get to know them and build a
Yeah.
genuine relationship. I have a close friend who's so good at this. Like no matter where we take her, she will like go meet we'll be at the same place.
Yes.
She's meeting the interesting people. She's getting like these cool like coffee and like all this stuff. And like we're there too, but
Yeah.
like she's actually talking to the person sitting next to us, or she's making conversation on her way to the bathroom. And she's just super open to meeting people and not always knowing where that's going to lead her, but just leading with, authenticity and curiosity. And
Yeah.
I think it's such an important skill to build, and it can be a little bit scary sometimes because you
Yeah.
don't always want to just go talk to the random person standing there. If you're at a wedding, you don't know
It's a
you.
practice.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it's a skill that you build, I think, and I think if you're not born
Yeah.
with that like natural ability to do that, that you absolutely can work on it and you can build that skill. And like you said, how randomly led you to your, huge 6-year career at TED just from
Yeah.
a random conversation at a random reception from a random wedding.
Totally. Yeah.
Ah,
Yeah, you have to just be open and like and work at it. I think in general, like a helpful thing that I keep in mind when I think about my work and my career, but honestly, life in general is how do I look at an opportunity and think like, how do I pick the thing that's gonna open doors instead of close them? And often like that is just like chatting with someone and being like, hey, like what's your name? What are you up to? Like what did you like about this thing that we just did? But other times it means like you get presented with like a job opportunity and you have to pick like, do I want this? Do I not? And a good framework to use is that framework of like, how do I pick the thing that opens more doors? Because I think you don't really want to be in a situation where you're closing doors for yourself. And
yeah.
sometimes we do that subconsciously. Like we don't even realize like, oh, like I just closed that door for myself. It might be like our internal talk that's saying like, I wouldn't be good at that. Or I don't have the experience to do that. So I'm not even gonna like really try. Um, I think there's always like a way to kind of learn more about an industry or like a thing that you want to pivot into and open a door for yourself and say like, all right, like I might not have the skills right now, but I could probably like reach out to that person and just have a conversation with them and be like, hey, what's your job like? What do you do for fun? What does your work life look like? And I think that opens a door where we may like accidentally have closed it for ourselves before.
Yeah. Yeah. I never really thought of it that way, but that's such a good mentality to have, or a good way to kind of start training your brain a little bit more to look at those relationships a lot differently. And just having an open
Yeah.
mind and just knowing like you never know. You may not know why you need that door right now, but it
Yeah,
may come back in a couple years later in a way that you never could have imagined.
definitely.
Okay, Valentina, this has been so much fun and so insightful and such a just fun topic to discuss. So thank you so much for kind of sharing your wisdom here. My last question for you today is just, do you have any last advice you'd like to share to someone who would love to have a career like yours?
I think don't put so much pressure on yourself. Like you are going to have jobs that you love and you're going to have jobs that you hate and you just kind of have to figure out along the way like what feels right for you. How can you kind of get closer to the thing that you ultimately want? And it's really hard to do that when you feel like, oh my God, so the next job that I have, like the job that I'm going to be at for 6 years, like that's not how I went into my career. I thought like, cool, I'll work at TED for like a year or two, we'll see what happens. And I think just taking some of the pressure off of like job hunting, off of deciding on your career. Like you don't have to be your next job forever, but you can be at your next job for a few years and like decide that you didn't like it and learn a lot of things from it and then have more information for the future. So I think we stress ourselves out a lot, but we can get a lot more out of this whole process if you just kind of like take a breath, give yourself some perspective, and just kind of take the pressure off a little bit. But thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun to get to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Valentina. Love that last piece of advice and just love chatting with you today. So thank you.